points. Look at the Boston players mobbing.
But Michael Jordan is not only the best basketball player, but he's the most exciting basketball player to ever play.
Tatum fires away, pumps it in. 51 for Jason Tatum.
The Big Three NBA podcast is powered by Prize Picks, the exclusive daily fantasy partner of the CLNS Media Network. Hello, folks. Welcome to another edition of the Big Three NBA podcast. I'm your host, Sherrod Blakely, and I'm joined by colleague, fellow Cuse alum, good friend Bobby Manning of CLNS Media. Bobby, how you doing?
Good. I was keeping an eye on the Cuse guys yesterday. Looks like Jesse Edwards got a deal, Quincy Carrier, but no Judah Mintz. Still waiting to see that one. Yeah, I think Judah's going to eat. Well, yeah, he's going to have to kind of basically come through the back door in the NBA, where go undrafted, do what Reeves did in LA, and just shock the world. Make a roster and then start making some money. Speaking of making money, our good friend, or soon to be good friend, Baylor Scheierman of Creighton. We're going to jump right into things and talk about the newest additions of the Celtics family. We're talking about Baylor Scheierman of Creighton by way of South Dakota State, and also Anton Watson, who one of the better players out west, did his thing for Gonzaga. But let's start with Baylor first, the 30th pick in the first round of this year's NBA draft. Tell us, just from what you've been able to kind of, what kind of player are the Celtics getting with Baylor from your perspective, Bobby? It looks like a shooter for the most part who has a little bit of ball handling skills and a lot of passing skills, which is what stands out when you watch him. When I talk to people about him who scouted him and evaluated him through this process, they're saying this isn't just Hauser. This isn't a guy who is just going to stand in the corner and shoot threes. He can do a little bit with the ball, which makes him a more versatile option. The name that keeps getting thrown out as a comparison constantly is Joe Ingles, because of his slow feet. He's not the quickest on his feet in terms of getting downhill or defending, which is going to be the skill that he has to develop the most. But the shooting's there from a bunch of different levels. He's got a nice floater around the rim, too, if guys are going to try to drive him off the line. And the three-point shooting's for real. 8 attempts a game, 38% last year. Creighton, he had like a close to 50% year his last year at South Dakota State. And as he talked about yesterday on the Zoom call, the introduction with Boston, he wanted to challenge himself. He wanted to go to a higher level. He worked out for Boston 2 years ago, and he got the feedback that you got to get a little more athletic. You got to get a little stronger. So he went back to school and did that with Creighton. That's when he transferred levels to go to the Big East. And, Sam Vecini, who scouts the draft really well and is a guy I read a ton on going into these draft classes every year, said he was one of the best players, period, in the Big East last year. So there's a skill set there all around offensively. You know what number really stood out to me, Sherrod? 9 rebounds a game last year. That's a big number.
Yeah, he his rebound, particularly at the defensive end of the floor, is just really off the charts. I mean, it ranks in terms. I think for his size and position, he's one of the better rebounders over the last 20, 25 years. To be able to be as steady and consistent in that particular area, and it's interesting because when you look at this Celtics team, you look at how their roster is constructed, and we talk about this all the time. One of the secret sauces to their success is the switchability. And so that you've got guys like Drew Holiday, who, even though he's your point guard, he can get you 6, 7, 8 rebounds. And if you got a guy, down the road like Baylor, who could potentially, be your off guard or your small forward coming off the bench, if he gets a switch out on a big, that you got a guy who's not afraid or isn't comfortable mixing it up around the glass and being a little bit of a banger. But the one thing you did mention, Bobby, that I wanted you to kind of talk a little bit more about was his three-point shooting. You look at his numbers when he was at South Dakota State and even at Creighton. A bad year for this guy was shooting around 40%. That's what you're getting. How impactful, or excuse me, how important do you think that part of his game is going to be to him sticking with the Celtics team? Because as you pointed out, Bobby, there's a lot of different things that he can do on the floor, but it seems like that might be the one thing that gives him the greatest opportunity, particularly when you talk about playing Missoula ball.
Yeah, and that's why they draft a guy like that, because that position's important, and it's going to play into this conversation we'll have this weekend, and it's going to start happening tomorrow as we record this, the team option on Sam Hauser. Do they decline that, put him in the free agency, try to match an offer there to keep him around long term? Do you talk extension with him? I know $8, $9, $10 million a year is kind of the number being tossed around for him. And potentially you lose him next summer. So is Scheierman a guy at 24, 25 who's ready, who has enough development, who's mature enough at that point to step into that role and bring a little bit more versatility? Sherrod, we were saying going into the playoffs, they'd be fortunate if Hauser can just survive, play some minutes for them, and just translate to the playoffs a little bit, give you 8, 9, 10, 11 minutes. And I know he really struggled against Indiana, but by the time the finals came around, the way Dallas was crowding the paint, Joe had to put Hauser out there again and again just to keep some spacing on the floor. And so that's a position he values. It's a skill set he values. And the fact that this guy can attack closeouts a little bit and play with a little bit more versatility, do some passing, I still think his skill set's going to be pretty narrow with what Boston's going to want him to do. Just knock down, catch and shoot shots, crash the boards out of the corners, do all those things Hauser did. But it's not going to be the shooting to me that defines whether he'll be able to get onto the floor. He's got to be able to survive defensively at this level. And when you do look at his defensive tape, there's some closeouts where he kind of overruns guys. There's some plays where he's reaching for the ball and gets beat off the dribble, being a little too enthusiastic there. And sometimes he's just not quick enough to keep up with guards who switch on to him. So he's going to have to get quicker. The testing numbers weren't bad for him in terms of quickness. Like, he wasn't terribly slow. I think he had the same 3/4 court sprint as Bronny. And, not that Bronny's like the bar or whatever, but you wouldn't think those two guys have the same speed there running full court. The agility stuff's going to be more important in terms of how his defense translates. But we asked these questions with Hauser, remember, Sherrod, and through some seasoning, through some strength training, and just overall development up in Maine, he was able to get there. So what I hear is he's probably not going to spend the whole season up in Maine, but he's also probably not going to play a ton for the Celtics. So you see him when there's rest, when there's injuries, that's probably the case. And then when he doesn't have minutes, he can get some reps up in Maine.
Yeah, well, I find it interesting, though, that they decided to take him in the first round, because you look at most of the mock projections, he was more likely than not a mid, maybe early second round pick. So maybe it felt that, and we'll talk more about Anton Watson later, but it felt that both of the players that the Celtics added were guys that they probably, I wouldn't say reached per se, but probably took them a little bit sooner than most prognosticators thought. Why do you think Baylor was a guy that they felt, that they had to get when they got him?
I think they were excited. Again, they had him in there 2 years ago. They clearly saw the development over the last 2 years at Creighton and the growth. And they said, maybe we can move back to 34. Maybe we can pick up a couple extra second round picks. But they did that last year. And Brad said going into the draft that there was a guy they loved at 30. They were going to take him there. So yes, it's guaranteed money. It's effectively the same money a minimum guy would have been this year. So you're paying $7, $8, $9 million salary and tax combined for this guy, but you also would have been paying that for whoever you just filled that roster spot with, whether it's a G League guy or just a veteran floating around. So they clearly loved him enough to say he might not play a lot this year. He might be expensive for a guy who doesn't play a lot, but we need to have him. And he's a level above some of the other guys we have on the board here. I know they were expecting him to probably go a little bit earlier there. And so when he pops up at 30, you get excited, you take him, and you don't even risk moving back and seeing him get taken right away. Because it was interesting. Some of the other guys I liked in that area, Jonathan Mogbo, Kyle Filipowski, they went right off the board at 31, 32. So if you're Boston, conceivably, if you move back to, let's say, 34, it's Scheierman, Mogbo, Filipowski, key guys that are on your board potentially there, going right off the board, 1, 2, 3. So I think Brad had to make a first-round pick eventually, Sherrod, and he did it this year.
I'm not going to lie to you, though. When I'm looking at that first-round play out and the Celtics are on the clock, I thought they're going to take Filipowski from Duke. I thought he of all the names that were kind of being bandied about, he was the one guy that had a skill set that you could see them benefiting from. A guy that had played in high level, high stakes type games. Were you surprised at all that they didn't kind of call an audible off the plan for the guy they actually wound up getting versus maybe going at potentially the best player available at that point?
So I don't have any intel on why they didn't take Filipowski. I know there's a lot of stuff floating out there around him, and we don't have to get into any of that. But in terms of the player and the injury status he had, a couple hip surgeries, I guess, is something that you worry about there. And just his overall ability to translate. The comparison you keep hearing around him is Olynyk. And Olynyk was good for the Celtics. He played a nice role for a couple of years for them and then moved on. But I would say he's more of an Olynyk light. I just don't see the same level of shooting ability across the floor, the same level of creation, and even the same level of defensive competitiveness Olynyk showed. I think he's close to that, but Olynyk wasn't the greatest shooter in the world as far as big men go. Wasn't the quickest footed off the dribble guy in terms of creating his own shot, and had some of those strength and length issues defensively. I know Filipowski has that negative wingspan you hear about that doesn't project well to him being,
if I remember correctly.
Yeah, those aren't very long bigs. So in terms of guaranteed money, in terms of filling a role eventually, you probably look at that guy and say, there's some bust potential here. There might not be enough athleticism. There might not be enough length for him to translate to the next level. Whereas with Scheierman, he's got a decent 6'8" wingspan, 6'9" wingspan for a guy who's 6'6", so there's some decent size there. He's grown stronger. He's grown a little faster. So there's some trajectory there, even for a 23-year-old. And that's something you got to talk about there is the age of the guys they drafted in terms of upside. But they maybe see more room for growth in Scheierman compared to Filipowski, and maybe a greater need in the near term. Again, Sherrod, Hauser could be gone next summer. And then at that point, shooting and versatility at that wing spot off the bench is not an easy skill set to find. We just saw Detroit trade for Tim Hardaway today, who's really not the biggest wing shooting, handling prodigy you'll see out there, but those guys are hard to find. And so Detroit says, all right, $16 million, I guess we'll take that guy on. So that's a position that commands a lot of money. That's a position that teams need and look for every summer. And so big man is certainly something that they're going to have to address. And I don't know if the second round pick is going to fulfill that potential in terms of replacing Horford eventually, sustaining the Kristaps Porzingis absence while he's out for 5-6 months. But they prioritize the shooting, the wing depth at that spot. And I don't blame them for it. I do think that's a very important position, especially for how they play.
You want to catch the hottest games this summer, but don't want to mortgage the family home or take a second job to do so, right? Game Time makes getting tickets to events like WNBA games even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. That's a huge get when it comes to getting great deals at the ballpark or basketball arena nearest you. Here in Boston, every season is sporting season. So for me, the Game Time app makes it super easy to find tickets for just about every sport in my area, which is great this time of year when family and friends just happen to pop into town at the last minute and you're scrambling to find something to do, and you're trying to find something to do that won't break the bank, like getting tickets to see the red-hot Red Sox play, who are playing some of their best baseball right now. Game Time has you covered. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code CLNS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create an account and redeem code CLNS for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you point that you brought up, which I think is an important one, and I wanted to talk to you a bit more about that, is the Hauser effect. I mean, it's amazing how a guy that when you start looking at just the kind of pecking order of this team, he doesn't necessarily stack up near the top. But when you look at the dimension of the game that he brings to this team, you realize how valuable he is. And I'm just curious, how much do you think his uncertain future long-term with the Celtics played into just the decision to go with a guy like Baylor Scheierman in the first round?
I think it certainly gives him some leverage at that spot as they go into the negotiation talks. He's never played a game yet for Boston, so there's only so much leverage he can carry into those conversations. He's going to have to show that he can contribute to them at a regular season level, and Hauser just proved he can play finals minutes. So Hauser's got some leverage here. Hauser, I think, is probably going to go to free agency when it's all said and done and see what he can get. Celtics will have to just play that game. I'm sure they're going to try to extend him, and it was interesting. Brad gleaned at their approach yesterday when he talked and said, we want Hauser here for a very long time. So how are they going to go about that? Again, I think it's going to be like an $8, $9, $10 million a year kind of offer. And you see if Hauser will accept that just for some of the long-term security and money at that spot, similar to what we're talking about with Derek White in those talks as well there. So it's something you have to think about. You can't keep everybody here, I would think. That's how they've talked. That's how they've approached this offseason so far in terms of saying, we want to keep these guys all around. You want to keep a championship team together, especially one that was as dominant as this one was. But eventually you have to think, Sherrod, Wyc wants to win. Wyc wants to sustain. Wyc wants to keep these guys together. But there has to be some number eventually that they hit where they're like, all right, we can't keep this guy in the mix if we're going to keep White, if we're going to keep this whole group together here. I guess you could extend everybody and then trade some guys down the line and figure it out that way. So you don't even have to go to free agency with these guys. And maybe that's what they'll do this weekend. But there's got to be some line they draw in the rotation in terms of who they pay and who they don't.
I think the line that we're starting to see, I wouldn't say it's etched in stone or even marker, but definitely in pencil. And I think it is Hauser, because when you look at this draft pick, that's one move. When you look at Peterson in the G League, who's a very similar player to Hauser in terms of being a really good shooter and lots of uncertainty about what he can do beyond that. And that was true of Hauser before he really had a couple of years to just kind of really develop his game at the other end of the floor. Because you look back at Hauser in the finals, and as much as he had, some really big shots, his defense on Luka was just exceptional. I thought he did one of the better jobs. And if you were to break down who are the top three Celtics defensively against Luka, I think Hauser might be in that top three behind Jalen and Drew. Probably, because I didn't think Derek White had much success defending Luka, but I look at Baylor as someone who could potentially over time give you comparable contributions. And then when you throw in Peterson up in the G League, I do think that the Celtics have some options that if they don't get an extension done, which I don't think they will, and he does hit free agency, and if he gets an offer that's just, again, Bobby, it hits that number that Wyc is just like, $15 million for Sam Hauser, can't do it. $8, $9 million, yeah, probably can. Then you let him go, and it won't devastate you. You won't have to be forced to go out and get a free agent shooter or forced to go out and draft a player, because at that point, you'd have a couple of guys already within your system who understand what you're looking for. The other point you made, Bobby, and I want us to kind of pivot to that, was you mentioned, the second round pick, Anton Watson, potential player who could help fill some of the voids that they're going to have in the front court this year. Al Horford is a year older. Porzingis is going to miss some time, certainly at the start of the season as he recovers from surgery. Take us through what you have kind of uncovered and learned about Watson, who I think is an interesting prospect. And like Baylor, he's a guy that's been in college 5 years, which I don't know I don't think we can diminish the importance and value of that. But what have you learned about Anton these last few days?
Yeah, another guy who went through the draft process previously, I think last summer, and decided to stay. He spent all 5 years at Gonzaga. He never left that area. I think he's from Spokane and went to Gonzaga Prep. So he's Washington through and through, and was a big part of those teams and played along, obviously, some great players there who've gone to the league, Chet Holmgren and Nembhard and some of the other guys you think of coming out of there, Jalen Suggs, among others. So he's been there through their whole run. He's been on some amazing teams, which is something Brad emphasized, a winning player, a winning team there in Gonzaga. So there's a real skill set there that you look at and say, does he bring some intangibles that exceed his physical skill set? Because he's not very tall. I don't know if they look at him as a 4 or 5. I know Vicini wrote he's probably going to be more of a 4. He doesn't shoot a ton. Every year he's shot a little bit more, but this year was the most, and that still only amounted to 1.5 a game. You look at the tape, there's some clips where he's just being ignored. Guys are tossing the ball out to him, and even when he's being ignored, he'll hesitate to shoot a little bit. Now, he does have a stroke. He hit 41% of those 54 attempts last year, which is, not too bad. So he's going to have to develop that, I think, to make it in this league. It was funny. KOC called him the old version of Al Horford. And I don't really see quite Horford level shooting skills there. But the defense is intriguing. And so you're picking at 54. The first thing you say is, all right, whoever you pick here is probably never going to make it. 2, all the guys you want to take are off the board already for the most part in the second round. I mean, I think a lot of the guys they had on their board in the 40s just were gone by that point already. So you're saying who's left? This is probably a guy who would have been an undrafted free agency, just considering where they picked him. So just take him anyway, have him in position to take what's probably going to be a 2-way deal here, and just see if he can continue to develop. Again, an older guy, I don't know how much room for growth there is. It was funny to hear Brad say they're going to put him in the gym and just say, shoot like you've never shot before. And we'll see how that pans out in Summer League. If he shoots really well in Summer League, that's where you start to get excited, I think, about him. Because the defense is for real. He can guard every position across the board, good anticipation, quickness to cut off passing lanes, length. I think he's got a 7-foot wingspan. So he's out there blocking shots on the perimeter and inside. And he's pretty strong, too. Maybe he went into last year's draft process a little bit high on the weight scale because I think he was 241 last summer and now he's down to 233. So maybe that's some feedback they got to cut down a little bit and, work on his shape. So he looks like a strong guy. He looks like a stout guy who can guard inside and have the quickness to guard on the outside. His vertical is not very high, but like with Scheierman, I don't think that really matters all that much. What matters is, can you defend? Can you play a role? And can you hit threes? And both these guys at least have, on paper, the ability to knock down a shot when needed, when left unguarded. And that's going to be the key to making it on the Celtics. I mean, as they go into this offseason and they assess Xavier Tillman's future, who I think is a pretty similar player skill set-wise to Watson here, when you look at guys that they're going to weigh bringing in into the future, I think a lot of it's going to be predicated on guys' ability to at least attempt three-point shots. You don't have to be Hauser or Curry, but you just need to command respect out there on the offensive end. And what worries me about Tillman and his future here, Sherrod, is number 1, Joe didn't go to him a lot. And number 2, teams really didn't have to guard him. And so I think Watson's arrival could speak to who they're preferring out of that Luke and Tillman conversation this summer.
Yeah. Well, the one thing about, when you look at, Baylor, and you look at, Watson and just what they each bring to their respective positions. Even though he's a late second-round pick, and again, those guys are just happy to be on an NBA roster at this point. I look at Watson as having a better shot at playing because there's going to be a need at some point sooner rather than later for someone who can play in that front court. And they're going to need someone who has – and the one thing that he does already at a relatively high level, which is something that when you look at the building blocks of this championship caliber team, is his ability to defend. His ability to, not be – to me, I call it the anti-Gobert syndrome. The ability to defend multiple positions so that the coach doesn't have to take you off the floor because you can't defend at certain critical moments in the game. I think Watson has the ability to give them that at some point. Now, it may not happen day one, but you at least know you're dealing with a player who, when you are challenging him to be a really good defender and have switchability skills, that's in his wheelhouse. You're not asking him to do something that is outside of his comfort zone or outside of his skill set. And again, the fact that when you start looking at the guys that they may potentially have playing behind Al and Porzingis, and we're talking about Tillman and Kornet specifically, neither one of those guys, I think, have the type of switchability potential that Watson has. And again, and Kata too. We didn't even talk about Kata. But Watson, I think if he can knock down some shots, makes things very interesting because as we've talked about, the Celtics are going to need someone off that bench in the front court to play early on. It may not be a starter, but there's going to be someone as a backup center, backup 4 or 5 guy that they're going to be leaning on sooner rather than later. And will that be the late second round pick, or will it be, whoever is still left on Celtics Island between Tillman and Kornet, both of whom I think will get some interest from other teams, because I think both of those guys in the playoffs showed you enough to where they understood the roles that they were asked to play, and more nights than not, they played those roles to the best of their ability. On our earlier podcast this week, Gary Washburn and I on the Big 3 NBA podcast, I asked Gary about who was the big surprise player for him this year, and you love this, Bobby, because this is one of the reasons why I want to go in here. Luke Kornet was his guy.
All right,
Luke Kornet was the guy. He was very high on what Luke was able to do, and it was a pleasant surprise that Luke was able to carve out a role for himself, consistent role, and to his credit, he did that night in, night out. My only issue with Luke really this season was that I felt as though this was a guy at Vanderbilt whose strength was his ability to help space the floor because of his shooting. And I've never gotten a sense that I don't know if it's whether he isn't comfortable doing that at this level or whether the Celtics have said, we don't need that from you. And if you're telling him you don't need that from him, why would you tell a guy who literally has what seems to be a skill that you like all your guys to have, and you don't take advantage of that skill? In other words, I would like to see Luke shoot the ball more, to be candid with you. But
yeah, more than one total for the entire season, which is what he did last year. So
right.
I don't have a great answer for that one either. And he's certainly been asked many times why that part of his game disappeared. Maybe it's a confidence thing. Maybe it's just a focus thing or emphasis on rim running, which is what his game has mostly become there, the pick and roll. So it is conceivable you lose both those guys. I thought Brad gleaned in both directions, saying that continuity is important at that center spot, which would point toward those kind of guys being back. And I think we got to throw O'Shea in there as well as an undersized guy, but someone who played in that role last year at times. And that they're probably looking at minimums lower on the roster in terms of that line. We're talking about them drawing on who's going to make what kind of money there. So is there interest in these kind of guys across the league, the backup centers there? Obviously, some teams drafted one. Khalil Ware to Miami might step into that role for a team like that. And then, of course, you got your Drew Eubanks and guys across the league who are probably just going to flip across different positions there. So when all the dust settles, how many backup center roles are there left across the league? I'd have to guess maybe like 5, 6, 7 that need to be filled. So it's a position of need. I think it's one of the biggest positions in the league that actually doesn't get filled to capacity each year because there just aren't enough quality bigs across the league anymore, to the point where every team's going to have 2 great ones. And the Celtics had, 4 quality guys last year at that spot? So that was the luxury they had last year in terms of, we have a guy who we can plug into every conceivable matchup, every conceivable position we need. Guys can take nights off. They sat 2 of their starters sometimes in Horford and Porzingis in 1 games last year. So it'd be a luxury to be able to bring back Kornet, Tillman, Brissett, all of those guys. But I do think a draft pick like Watson, and Kate is here as well, starts to forecast the fact that, all right, maybe Luke can go out and get mid-level money, or Tillman's switchable defense and elite analytics at that spot allow him to go out and get a deal, and his relative youth too. You wonder how much they liked Tillman and what he ended up giving them there, just based on how much they played him. So that goes into the account of paying these guys too. And Kornet on the average night isn't going to play if the 2 bigs are there, especially in the playoffs. So depth's important, but a team like this can only pay so much for depth. So it's going to be very interesting to see what they do at that spot because they're going to need it, right? With Porzingis out for so long, and who knows how he's going to come back from that injury after. So do you look at a guy who's a little cheaper, who has a little bit more trust in terms of stepping into an every night role if you need it, because you can't be playing Horford 35, 40 minutes a night. Who knows if you're going to have Porzingis come playoff time. So I tossed him out there when I had Gary on the Garden Report a week ago or 2, but you got to consider a guy like Daniel Theis, I think. because this is a guy who has started for this team in this league, is capable of playing an everyday role at that spot. And he's a little bit older, probably got a few miles and injuries that have bumped him down to where a little below where he was previously. But let's say Al has to miss some time during the 5 to 6 months that Porzingis is out. Can you play Kornet and Tillman every single night as your starting and backup center during that stretch, or even one of them? So that's something they're going to have to consider there as they start to look at bringing these guys back or who they're trusting in these spots. Like, Cade has got potential. It was great to see him play well for a week last year. But again, Horford goes down for a week or two. You're playing Cade and Kornet at center for that whole stretch. I don't know. So there's not a lot of backup centers out there. There's certainly not a lot of affordable backup centers out there. But Theis is one to me that makes all the sense in the world.
The Boston Celtics just added another championship to their NBA record 18 titles, but there's plenty of games to keep the die-hard sports fans and the casuals more than happy. You can get in on the action with Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with more than 5 million active members. Prize Picks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Unlike other apps, on Prize Picks, it's just you against the numbers. All you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 players' stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. And there's no better time than now to get in on the action. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. Now for the Mathematically Challenge, here's what that means. You can turn $10 into $1,000 just like that. Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and the rest of the Boston Celtics are still celebrating, but that doesn't mean the basketball stops bouncing with Prize Picks. Women's basketball is still heating up with stars like Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese looking to make names for themselves alongside some of the WNBA greats such as Breanna Stewart and Asia Wilson. You can win up to 100 times your cash watching them ball out this summer. For me, I love the ease and convenience Prize Picks offers by being able to pick more or less on 2 to 6 players. It's super easy to get involved and it's a lot of fun. So to get in on the fun, just download the Prize Picks app today and use code CLNS for a first deposit match up to $100. That's code CLNS, downloading the Prize Picks app and use the code CLNS for a first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
Yeah, I mean, and as someone who is a major Daniel Theis fan, I would love for him to be back. I just think that not only in terms of what he brings from a basketball playing standpoint and kind of, fill in the gap when you've got a whole standpoint, but just a good guy to have in your locker room. I mean, I think that's the one thing about the Celtics that this year just kind of flew under the radar, was that this was one of the few years where there really wasn't any type of significant turmoil or issues inside the locker room that maybe seeped out onto the court. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the guys that they brought in just have a much more we're just trying to get along and win games mindset, as opposed to I need to get my numbers, or I need to get my minutes, or I need to get me.
Yeah.
And you didn't really see much of that. And I think as they look to build this thing out and try to keep that window, that championship window, open as long as possible, I think it takes on a much more significant importance to them when they're assembling this roster, because you've seen what it looks like when you have a good team and you don't have drama. You don't have in locker room bickering. What happens? You won a championship. So if conventional wisdom tells you you want to keep that, or certainly make that part of what you're looking to do going forward. And that's why it'll be interesting to see how Brad goes about building on the success of this team. But one of the first things that obviously plays a role in that is when we talk about free agency, you got to start with your own. The guys that you had on your championship team, and how many of those are you going to bring back? I think it kind of goes without saying that Tatum is going to get that Supermax extension. And everything that Brad has said, everything that Wick has said indicates that Derek White is going to get paid as well. Now, after those two guys, I think it gets a little bit murky as far as who's coming back and who might be moving on. Who
who's the one play? Is there one or two players outside of those two, Derek White and Tatum, that you would like to see back among the guys that could potentially leave?
You know me, Sherrod. I would love to see Luke Kornet back. And
I should preface it by saying besides Luke.
But from there, I mean, you want to bring Keita back on that team option, which I think is an easy decision. I think, again, there's that possibility that you let Hauser go into restricted free agency and use that as a way to leverage him into a long-term deal. I wouldn't mess with that. I would just take that blessing of him at $2 million next year and figure it out from there. So I think that's what you do with him. Tillman's the weird one to me because, yes, you love Luke. He's the guy Joe trusts. He's the guy who's been the best third center on the roster for a while here. Tillman, though, is there something there? Do you see him as a long-term Al replacement? Do you see his offensive game developing beyond where it is? Do you see him staying healthy? That knee continues to be an issue for him going back to Michigan State. And do you see him playing consistently if you do give him a little bit of a paid bump, which they have the right to with those bird rights there? That's going to be the most interesting question in the summer for me. Again, I think it's conceivable you could lose both of those guys, Kornet and Tillman, if another team really likes them and gives them mid-level money there. Do they want to stay? I know they both have families. I know they've both settled and gotten comfortable in Boston. Tillman, obviously, over a shorter span since the deadline there. So is that a factor as well, that those guys will maybe take a little bit less to stay on this championship team and, make Boston their home? I don't think you ever assume that's the case, but that would be ideal for Boston. So those are obviously the top two guys there. I think Shvima Hailuke's probably going to go, especially with Scheierman coming in. I'm sure there'll be some big money for him overseas, as there was last summer in his case, especially after he gets a ring there. But you always want to try to stay in the NBA. And then at that point, O'Shea Brissett, I have to think he's probably gone. I know the buzz is he wants to stay, and that he opted out, just to see the options there and, go into free agency. It was just $2.5 million, and they could certainly offer him that again. Maybe that for 2 years gets it done, double the total guaranteed money there. But I don't know. The 3-point shooting wasn't what they probably hoped it would be. He didn't play a ton. They went more with double big and some of those backup bigs over him. The East Conference Finals moment he had was great, and small ball looked intriguing there, but the Celtics really didn't do that all that much. So where ultimately does he fit in that bigger dynamic there? You're certainly going to offer him a minimum to stay, but do you offer him 2 years at the minimum to stay? I think that's going to be the question with him.
Yeah, I suspect that he's going to get a better offer elsewhere. Or he's going to get a comparable offer that has a clearer window of playing time, because I think he's at that point in his career where he wouldn't mind maybe taking a little less money if it means a bigger role on the team. He's not, this isn't a guy that's at the end of his career where you just want to be in a winning situation and you don't really care about the money. No,
would he go back to Indiana? Maybe.
I think he would.
Yeah.
I think he would. And I think Indiana, it would be wise for them to try to bring him back.
He was good for them.
Because you look at the way that team is trending, the way that their players play, he seems like an ideal fit in what they're trying to do. His defensive versatility, I think his three-point shooting, I thought this year was a little bit of an anomaly. I think he's a better shooter than we saw this year. And Indiana, similar to what we talk about Daniel Theis in Boston, that familiarity that he has with Indiana, I think certainly makes him someone that the Pacers should give some thought to. Absolutely. Now, as much as the Celtics are obviously going to be looking to make some decisions on who to keep, who to let go, and how many checks is Wick, how big a tab is Wick willing to pick up to keep winning championships. The Celtics are not the only team that's looking to make moves. And I wanted us to kind of talk a little bit about the New York Knicks, who seem to have made some pretty powerful moves that I don't know if it's not like, what Boston did back in 2007 when you create a big three, or what Miami Heat did when they added LeBron and Chris Bosh. But forming like Villanova North with the Knicks, with the latest addition with Bridges, they look legit. Like what they did this past season, they can build off of that and be
one of the last teams standing in the East.
Yeah, it's dangerous what they put together there. All those wings, all that versatility alongside the perimeter with how they guard. You're certainly going to still have to protect Brunson at that spot if you're talking about what now Knicks Celtics would look like in a playoff series. That's the big one there, is whether they can back him up. And center is going to be a question for them too, because obviously with the decision they make to bring in Bridges, they're hard capped for now. They can change that with how the deal ultimately comes out. Maybe they can pull in another team, or I won't get into all the mechanisms, but they effectively hard cap themselves at the point that OG's $40 million deal brings them right up until. So as it stands, they have no way to bring back Isaiah Hartenstein, who was obviously their starting center through that run. Mitchell Robinson steps in at the 5. He has really struggled to stay on the floor the last handful of years here. So there's still some questions on that Knicks roster. And of course, the star power is great, but it's not on Boston's level. They don't have a Drew Holiday. They don't have, I guess, Bridges is on like that Derek White level in terms of impact, probably even a little higher based on what he showed in Brooklyn there. And they paid a high price for it. I don't mind that as much. You know me, Sherrod, I don't worry about the picks. You can always find them. You can always find young guys. So I think that was wise for them. You have a moment to really upgrade your roster. All you're giving up in players there is Bojan Bogdanovic. It was a no-brainer. And there's something to be said about that chemistry those guys played with, too. You saw it manifest itself in the Villanova guys who were on the roster already. I thought DiVincenzo was outstanding there last year. Julius Randle comes back into the fold. That's a guy I think Knicks fans go back and forth on. At the end of the day, I think it's better to have him than not have him. But the playoff numbers have been ghastly, and he's an expensive guy if you're trying to build out a roster around those Villanova guys. Is he someone who you maybe look to move on from for a center there? I think if I'm them, I'd be calling Detroit about Isaiah Stewart. You know, would they be interested in moving on from a guy like that to get a scorer in Randall? And then you free up a ton of money in the process there. So I don't know if the Knicks are done shuffling the deck yet here. The roster as it stands looks really compelling to the point where I would call them the second best team in the East, and a team that could probably scrap with the Celtics a little bit. But I don't look at them as a team that could beat the Celtics yet, Sherrod. But let's see what happens with Porzingis. Let's see how healthy and fiery the Celtics come into next year. As Brad talked about, obviously, human nature and the hangover effect are going to be the biggest thing they're battling more than New York or Milwaukee or any of these competitors.
Yeah, and that's my biggest concern with them because, you know, just having dealt with teams that have won championships, the biggest challenge they have is themselves. And it's not a conscious thing. It's just that when they're going through the grind of the regular season, they know in the back of their minds that while all of this has value, it's what I do in April, May, and June that ultimately determines how all this is going to play out. So if I lose 2 or 3 games in the middle of December, and our fan base is going crazy thinking that the world is falling, you know, trade Tatum, trade Brown, trade them all, they're not going to be as bothered by that as I think they would be if, let's say, they hadn't had a championship and they don't know what that run looks like. And so I think that's going to be Joe Mazzulla's ability to manage the egos and keep these guys playing with a sharp enough edge during the regular season. I think it's going to be really, really challenging for them. But one of the points you made earlier, Bobby, that I want to kind of delve into a little bit more, but specifically about the Knicks, is Julius Randle. I do think they need to move on from Julius. I think he is the piece that if they can use him to get either a stretch big or a big that gives him a little bit more defensive versatility, I think that would be the piece that could potentially make them almost eye to eye with the Celtics. I think Boston should win a series if they were to play, but I do think they need to do something at that center position in order to give themselves a better chance to compete with the Celtics. Because right now, you know, Mitchell Robinson he's a good big. He really is. But he's not stretching the floor. He's not defensively. He's good around the basket, but I don't think he closes out on perimeter bigs as well as you would want. And again, the versatility. I like Tatum's chances when he gets a switch and Mitchell's on him. I like Jalen's chances when there's a switch and he's on him. I like pretty much every Celtic, if they get a switch on Mitchell Robinson, because it's not that he's a bad defender. It's just that they're better offensive players.
Stewart, you mentioned, I think is interesting. I've been a big fan of his for a long time. Physical guy. He's very much a throwback-ish type of NBA big who has actually developed a pretty decent perimeter game. That's something I know when I talked to him a couple years ago about just being in Detroit and some of the things he wants to get better at. He made mention that was the one thing that he knows over the course of his career he has to improve upon. But you're right, Bobby. I think the Knicks are probably the biggest threat to the Celtics going into next season. And it remains to be seen what teams like the Milwaukee Bucks will do. And, some of the other teams, Atlanta, they with the number one pick, you just never know how that's going to play out with them as well. And some other teams in the East. But in general, Bobby, what's your feeling or sense of the Celtics and their chance of the repeat? I mean, are you feeling great about that, good about that, or I don't know?
Porzingis thing worries me a little bit, just because I don't know what's going on there. It's a very rare injury. I don't think there's a lot of cases in the past to look at and say, this is how he's going to come back. This is how he's going to sustain after recovering. And the timeline, to me, blew me away a little bit. I knew there'd be some questions about training camp, and Brad said at least the very start of next season, but we're talking about 20, 30 games here that he's going to be out. And at that point, is he just starting to ramp up? Is he ready to go around Christmas? There's a lot of questions there. He missed time this year, but it was never this much time, even in the playoffs. So that's a real question for me. They were successful without him last year, but as we talked about earlier in the pod, they had a lot of depth to help sustain that. Horford's a year older. Can you put the pressure of that world on his shoulders? The East shouldn't be a problem to me. I think someone on the Garden Report with us, I forget who it was, put it well that maybe, I think it might have been Jimmy, maybe you don't win the East by 15 games this year. Maybe it's just 3 or 4 or something like that because of the injuries here and the hangover effect or whatever other challenges you run into, losses on the roster. So there's definitely a smaller room for error next year. Teams are going to upgrade. Teams are going to build themselves to challenge you like New York did with this latest move. And you're going to be the hunted in many ways, as Brad Stevens talked about. So I like their chances to repeat. Just like Denver last year, I think the champion coming back with its full roster, more or less, should be considered the favorites. And anyone out west who you're worried about, whether it's Minnesota, who I thought had an excellent draft and is going to try to make some improvements, I'm sure, along the edges of their roster beyond that. And the Nuggets, who really need that bench piece. Bruce Brown used to fill there, but still look pretty enticing as a roster and have the best player in the NBA right now. Those are the kind of teams you're looking at and a little worried about. But again, many of those teams are out west, and you don't have to worry about them until they get to the finals. And that's what happened last year. Denver loses in the second round. You never have to worry about Denver. So given the conference they play in, given the state of that conference still, and just how many guys they're bringing back from that run, they are definitely prohibitive favorites going into next year. Now, let's see what the impact of Porzingis is. Let's see who they bring back on the bench. But right now, I think it's pretty clear.
Absolutely, absolutely. But we shall see. We shall see. Bobby Manning, CLNS Network. Bobby, thanks so much for your time. Before we go, though, a quick shout out to Prize Picks, the exclusive daily fantasy partner of CLNS Media. Also, our good friends at Game Time, which takes the guesswork out of buying last-minute tickets to your favorite sporting events. Just download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code CLNS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. For Bobby Manning, this is Sherrod Blakely, and this is the Big Three NBA Podcast.